Vancouver, Canada, a city known for its majestic skyline and picturesque coastal views, is now facing an existential threat that could alter its future forever. The housing crisis in Vancouver has already reached unprecedented levels, with skyrocketing prices pushing homeownership out of reach for most residents. Developers are abandoning projects, and countless individuals are being squeezed out of the market. But the problem does not stop there. The very infrastructure that has allowed Vancouver to thrive for decades is now teetering on the brink of collapse. Aging dams, once thought to be secure, are deteriorating faster than anyone anticipated. This new threat has the potential to unleash a flood of destruction that could not only worsen the housing crisis, but could drown the entire region in financial and human disaster. The aging dams that serve as critical flood defenses for the city are reaching the end of their lifespan, and their failure could lead to catastrophic consequences for thousands of Vancouver's residents. The issue at hand is not just about the housing crisis anymore. It's about the looming danger of flooding that could devastate homes, businesses, and communities throughout Vancouver. Experts from Canadian Hydropower Corporation, CHC, have raised alarm bells regarding the condition of these aging structures. Built in the mid-20th century, these dams were designed to control floodwaters in the region's most vulnerable areas. However, years of neglect, lack of investment, and outdated infrastructure have left them increasingly vulnerable to failure. The potential impact of a dam collapse is nothing short of catastrophic, with entire neighborhoods at risk of being inundated by floodwaters. As it stands, Vancouver is already struggling to cope with the fallout from its housing crisis. Affordability is at an all-time low, with the average home price far beyond the reach of many families. The collapse of these dams would only compound the city's problems, leading to widespread displacement, further economic downturn, and a public health disaster. While Vancouver has always prided itself on being a world-class city, its current predicament is a harsh reminder that even the most resilient cities can crumble under the weight of their own success and neglect. As housing prices continue to soar, fewer and fewer people are able to find stable housing. A recent report by the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, CMHC, shows that Vancouver's rental market is facing the highest vacancy rates in decades, and homeownership has become a distant dream for the majority of residents. But this alone is not the full picture. Alongside the housing crisis, the failure of Vancouver's critical infrastructure is setting the stage for a new and much more severe crisis, a flood of unimaginable proportions. The damage that could result from the failure of Vancouver's aging dams would go far beyond real estate. The floodwaters would not only destroy homes but would also cripple businesses, damage vital infrastructure, and disrupt transportation and communication networks across the city. Thousands of families could lose everything they own in a matter of hours. Financial losses could reach into the billions, with insurance companies struggling to cover the extensive damage. The social and emotional toll on the people of Vancouver would be immeasurable, as families are displaced and forced to cope with the fallout from both the housing crisis and the natural disaster. While experts have been warning about the need for infrastructure upgrades for years, the government has done little to address the growing threat. Public funds remain tight, and political leaders are more focused on short-term solutions that avoid addressing the long-term risks that are so clearly outlined by experts in hydrology and infrastructure. The lack of urgency has led to a situation where the city's dams, once the cornerstone of flood protection, are now seen as ticking time bombs. With the risk of flooding now higher than ever, it's clear that Vancouver is running out of time to address the crisis before it's too late. Recent assessments by Scotiabank and other financial institutions suggest that the financial strain on Vancouver's economy is already severe. The real estate sector is on the brink of collapse, with thousands of unsold properties piling up as prospective buyers shy away due to both the unaffordability of housing and the looming flood threat. Developers are pulling out of projects, unable to secure financing due to the uncertain future of the region's infrastructure. The entire housing market is in freefall, and the economic consequences are devastating. As interest rates rise and more people are unable to afford the already inflated costs of housing, Vancouver's real estate bubble is deflating. But it's not the only disaster waiting to happen. The fact that the city's flood defenses are weakening only exacerbates the situation. The crumbling dams are not just a theoretical risk, they are a real and present danger. In 2023, a report by the University of British Columbia, UBC, found that over 60% of Vancouver's dams were operating beyond their design capacity. Yet, the necessary repairs and upgrades have been delayed for years due to political indecision and lack of funding. The aging infrastructure has led to an increase in the number of dam malfunctions, further raising alarms. The UBC report also pointed out that the city's emergency response plans are insufficient to handle a potential large-scale flooding event, leaving citizens vulnerable and exposed. Vancouver is facing a double whammy. Its housing market is collapsing, and its flood protection systems are failing at the same time. To make matters worse, the city's already overburdened social services will be unable to cope with the additional strain caused by widespread displacement. Thousands of people will need to be evacuated and housed, and the demand for emergency aid will overwhelm the city's resources. In a city where homelessness has already reached crisis levels, the prospect of more people being displaced by flooding is terrifying. As shelters fill up, there will be nowhere for people to go, exacerbating the already dire housing crisis. The growing financial instability is a direct result of both the housing market's collapse and the aging infrastructure's risk of failure. Vancouver is already on the brink of an economic collapse, and the situation will only worsen if the dams fail. Local businesses will be devastated, insurance companies will face massive payouts, and the city will be left scrambling for funds to rebuild. The implications of such a disaster would be felt across Canada, as Vancouver is one of the country's economic powerhouses, and its collapse would reverberate across all sectors, from real estate to transportation, from tourism to technology. In response to the growing crisis, some have called for urgent action to address both the housing crisis and the flood risk. But political leaders have remained largely silent, unwilling to take decisive action. The provincial government has promised to allocate funds to repair the dams, but these efforts are still in the planning stages, with no clear timeline for when the necessary work will begin. Meanwhile, Vancouver's residents continue to live in fear, knowing that their homes, businesses, and even their lives are at risk from the impending flooding. This crisis is not just a potential disaster, it is a ticking time bomb. The aging dams that have long provided Vancouver with flood protection are now a threat to the city's very existence. The government's failure to act has left the population exposed to a devastating future. As the city's housing crisis worsens and the threat of flooding grows more imminent, Vancouver stands at the precipice of a disaster that could wipe out generations of progress in a matter of hours. It is a wake-up call that the city cannot afford to ignore. The time to act is now, before it's too late. In the coming weeks, Vancouver must confront the reality of its situation. The housing market, the flood risk, and the city's future are all intertwined in a complex web of crisis. What happens next will determine whether Vancouver can weather this storm, or whether it will succumb to the destruction that is already on the horizon. As Vancouver's housing crisis deepens, the stakes have never been higher. The risk of catastrophic flooding looms larger every day, fueled by the aging dams that were once considered the city's first line of defense. The consequences of inaction are too severe to ignore. If these dams fail, the resulting damage won't just be a temporary setback. It could wipe out entire communities, cripple the economy, and change Vancouver forever. Yet, as the danger grows, political leaders remain paralyzed, unwilling to take decisive action to protect the city from this imminent threat. What's at stake now is not just the future of Vancouver's housing market, but the safety and well-being of its citizens. The housing crisis in Vancouver is already pushing the city to the brink. Skyrocketing property values, coupled with an influx of foreign investors and speculation, have made homeownership unattainable for most residents. Meanwhile, rental prices have reached astronomical levels, leaving working-class families struggling to find stable housing. The ripple effects of this housing collapse are being felt across the region, as entire neighborhoods become unaffordable for the average Canadian. The social fabric of Vancouver is being torn apart, and yet, the threat of flooding could further unravel the already fragile housing market. If the dams fail, Vancouver's most vulnerable residents will face even greater hardship. The very homes they've worked so hard to secure will be washed away in the blink of an eye. The human cost of this impending disaster cannot be overstated. Vancouver's population is growing, but its housing options are shrinking. Thousands of people are already living in substandard conditions, and as prices climb higher, many are being forced into homelessness or to flee the city entirely. A recent study by RBC found that more than 30% of Vancouver's residents spend over half of their monthly income on housing. In a city that once prided itself on its high standard of living, this is a crisis of unprecedented proportions. Now, with the threat of flooding hanging over their heads, the situation has become even more dire. People who have already sacrificed so much to afford a roof over their heads now face the terrifying possibility of losing everything. If the dams fail, It won't just be homes that are lost. Entire communities will be wiped out as floodwaters surge through Vancouver's neighborhoods. The financial impact will be staggering, with damages reaching into the billions of dollars. Insurers are already bracing for a massive payout, but no amount of money can replace the lives lost or the communities destroyed. The devastation will ripple through the economy as businesses are forced to close and thousands of people are displaced. The city's infrastructure, already under strain, will be stretched beyond its limits, and recovery efforts will take years, if not decades. The human toll will be felt for generations to come. The collapse of Vancouver's housing market and the impending threat of flooding are not isolated issues. They are symptoms of a larger problem: the failure of the city's leadership to address the growing risks facing its residents. Despite repeated warnings from experts, political leaders have failed to take action. In fact, much of the city's infrastructure has been allowed to deteriorate to the point where a disaster is no longer a matter of if, but when. The aging dams are just one example of how Vancouver's infrastructure is failing. From crumbling roads to outdated sewage systems, the city's once reliable infrastructure is showing signs of wear. The failure to address these issues has left Vancouver vulnerable to the very crises it was once prepared to handle. The city's political leaders have been slow to act, often bogged down by bureaucratic red tape and the inability to agree on a course of action. Funding for infrastructure improvements has been minimal, and public-private partnerships designed to address the city's housing crisis have failed to live up to expectations. Vancouver is stuck in a cycle of inaction, as its leaders continue to promise change without ever delivering. The public has grown increasingly frustrated with the lack of progress, and the city's residents are paying the price for this failure. But there is still hope. It is not too late for Vancouver to take action and avert the worst of this crisis. Immediate steps must be taken to address both the housing crisis and the flood risk. The city must invest in upgrading its aging infrastructure, starting with the dams that are at the heart of the problem. This will require a significant financial commitment, but the cost of inaction is far greater. Vancouver's leaders must prioritize the safety and well-being of their citizens above all else. They must work with experts in hydrology and engineering to ensure that the city's flood defenses are updated and strengthened before disaster strikes. At the same time, Vancouver must take urgent steps to address the housing crisis. The city must find ways to increase the supply of affordable housing, especially for those most at risk of being displaced by the flood threat. This could involve incentivizing the construction of low-income housing, providing subsidies to renters, and introducing rent controls to prevent prices from spiraling out of control. Developers must also be held accountable for abandoning projects in flood-prone areas, and new regulations must be put in place to ensure that future developments are built with climate change in mind. The government must also address the root causes of the housing crisis, including the role of foreign investment and speculation in driving up property prices. It's clear that the current system is failing Vancouver's residents, and bold action is needed to correct course. This will require a shift in policy and a commitment to long-term solutions that prioritize people over profit. Vancouver's housing crisis is a complex issue, but it is not insurmountable. With the right leadership and a clear plan of action, the city can overcome this crisis and build a more sustainable future for all its residents. But the clock is ticking. As the housing market continues to falter and the flood threat grows, Vancouver's future hangs in the balance. Will the city's leaders step up to the challenge, or will they continue to let Vancouver's infrastructure deteriorate until it's too late? The outcome is still uncertain, but one thing is clear: action must be taken now, before disaster strikes. If you're as concerned about Vancouver's future as we are, leave a comment below with the number 1 and hit subscribe to stay updated on this unfolding crisis. There is still time to make a difference, but only if we act now. Don't miss our next video, where we'll dive deeper into the financial collapse facing Vancouver and what it means for the rest of Canada. Stay informed, stay prepared, and stay tuned.